Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And yet how many of us live our entire lives avoiding that privilege? We wear masks, we follow scripts, we silence the voice within us just to maintain harmony on the outside. We confuse fitting in with belonging. And slowly, quietly, we drift away from who we really are. But something extraordinary begins to happen when you stop running from your truth and start living from it. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it is powerful. Because when you begin to live from your truth, your life begins to align not with what the world expects, but with what your soul knows. You know, there's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from running a marathon or working a 12-hour shift. It comes from pretending. It comes from waking up every day and putting on a mask you've worn so long, it almost feels like skin. You walk into rooms, relationships, careers, even conversations, showing only the parts of yourself you think will be accepted, approved, applauded. And every time you do, a tiny piece of you folds inward, quietly waiting for the day it can finally breathe. But the thing is, it never truly does until you choose to stop pretending. There's a moment, and it might come quietly, maybe while you're brushing your teeth, or standing alone in an elevator, or looking in the mirror with eyes that are just tired, where you feel the weight of all you've been carrying, and it clicks. You realize that so much of your pain, your anxiety, your restlessness, it isn't because you're broken. It's because you've been living out of alignment with who you really are. You've been playing a role in someone else's play on a stage you didn't even want to be on in the first place. We all do it. Some of us learn to do it so well that we start calling it being successful or doing what we're supposed to. We curate our lives like highlight reels, keeping only what will get applause. We become performers, not just to the world, but to ourselves. But deep down, we know. We know when something's off, when we're saying yes out of guilt or fear or habit, when we're laughing in rooms where our soul is silent, when we're chasing things that don't actually matter to us, just to prove something to people who probably aren't even paying attention. And it's not that we're liars or fakes. It's that we've been taught, sometimes gently and sometimes violently, that who we really are is too much or not enough, too sensitive, too bold, too quiet, too different. And so we shrink, we bend, we become palatable, we become what we think will keep us loved. But the soul doesn't play that game forever. There comes a point when the mask begins to crack. Not because you failed, but because you're finally waking up. You start to feel the difference between fitting in and belonging, between impressing and connecting, between looking successful and feeling whole. And in that space, raw, uncertain, but honest, you begin to ask the real questions. Who am I underneath it all? What do I actually want? What do I believe? Not because someone told me, but because I know it in my bones. That's when things begin to shift. Because when you start living from your truth, and I mean really living it, not just speaking it when it's convenient, you begin to feel lighter. You're not dragging around the weight of your performance anymore. You're no longer exhausting yourself trying to be everything to everyone. You're just being you. And the most miraculous thing about that? It's enough. You don't have to strategize every word, edit your personality, or monitor how much of your heart you're allowed to show. You don't have to remember who you were with this person or that one, because now you're just one person. Whole. Unapologetic. Real. Of course, it's not always easy. Living from your truth doesn't mean life gets perfect. It just means it gets honest. And honesty invites clarity. Some people will leave, not because you did anything wrong, but because they were attached to your mask, not your soul. Let them, because the people who stay, the ones who show up when you show up as you, Those are the ones you've been waiting for. And yes, the world might feel uncertain at first without all the roles and scripts, but in that uncertainty is freedom. You start making decisions not from fear or obligation, but from alignment, from self-respect, from love. Not the kind that needs to be earned, but the kind that just is, because you finally remembered that you're worthy of it by being exactly who you are. So if you feel tired, not just in your body, but in your being, ask yourself, what part of me am I still hiding? What truth have I silenced to make others comfortable? And more importantly, am I ready to finally come home to myself? Because the moment you decide to stop pretending is the moment your life truly begins. Once you begin living from your truth, something remarkable starts to happen. Something subtle at first, but deeply transformative. You begin to feel a quiet strength building within you. It's not the kind of strength that needs to shout, prove, or dominate. It's not bravado or arrogance. It's confidence, the real kind. The kind that doesn't come from being liked, praised, or even understood. It comes from knowing who you are and being okay with it. This kind of confidence doesn't show up all at once. It builds in moments. Like the first time you say no without explaining yourself. The first time you speak a truth, even when your voice shakes. The first time you walk away from something that no longer fits. Not because it's easy, but because you can finally admit to yourself that you've outgrown it. When you start living from that place, from your center, your truth, you stop looking outside yourself for direction. The noise of comparison begins to quiet down. You no longer need everyone to agree with you. You no longer feel the pressure to shapeshift into what's acceptable in the moment. You begin to move through the world with a sense of clarity. Even when you don't know what's coming next, you trust yourself to handle it. That's what real confidence feels like. Not certainty about the future, but certainty about yourself. And that's the shift that changes everything. You see, when you live disconnected from your truth, you give your power away. You second-guess yourself. You wait for permission. You shrink yourself into roles that feel safe, even if they feel suffocating. And slowly, your self-trust erodes. You start relying on others to tell you who you are, what's right, what's wrong, what's worth chasing. But no one else lives in your body. No one else hears the quiet whispers of your intuition. No one else can define your path. So when you begin to come back to your truth, to really own it, even in the face of discomfort, your relationship with yourself transforms. You become your own anchor. You stop asking, will they approve, and start asking, is this true for me? And every time you honor the answer, no matter how small the moment seems, you strengthen that inner foundation. That's where confidence lives, in those quiet choices that no one sees. It's built in the solitude of your own becoming. And it's unshakable, not because life stops challenging you, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself. Confidence, when it's rooted in truth, is not loud. It doesn't need to convince or dominate. It simply is. You walk into a room, not needing to perform or impress, just present, just grounded. And that kind of presence can't be faked. It's felt. People sense it. They may not even know why, but they feel safer around someone who is fully at home in themselves. And ironically, the more grounded you become in your truth, the less reactive you are to the world around you. You don't need to win every argument or control every outcome. You're no longer triggered by other people's opinions or projections. You know what's yours and what isn't. You don't confuse rejection with failure. You don't confuse success with applause. You begin to measure your life not by how it looks, but by how it feels. And that internal shift redefines how you show up in your work, your relationships, your creativity, your boundaries. People often chase confidence by changing their appearance, their titles, their social circles, thinking if they just look the part, they'll finally feel whole. But all of that is surface. The real work, the lasting work, begins inside. When you live from your truth, you begin to realize that confidence isn't something you acquire, it's something you uncover. It was there all along, buried under layers of self-doubt, fear, and the need to please. Living from your truth is the process of peeling back those layers. It's not always graceful. Sometimes it's messy, uncomfortable, even painful. But underneath all of it, there you are, steady, clear, and enough. And once you've touched that place within yourself, you stop chasing approval like a lifeline. You stop waiting to be ready or perfect. You start showing up as you are, and that alone becomes your power. Because the truth is, no one else can give you real confidence. They can encourage you, sure. They can support you. But the kind of confidence that lasts, the kind that sustains you through both triumph and failure, only comes when you know you are living in integrity with yourself. And when you do, nothing and no one can take it away. There's something quietly powerful that starts happening when you begin living from your truth. The world around you starts to rearrange itself. And not because you're forcing it, or manipulating the outcomes, or chasing people down. It shifts because your energy shifts. When you stop pretending and start living in alignment with who you really are, you stop broadcasting confusion, you stop sending mixed signals to life, and instead, you begin to radiate something clear, something authentic, something unmistakably you. That clarity becomes a kind of filter. It doesn't just change what you attract, it changes what you allow. You become less available for relationships built on pretending, on performance, on mutual avoidance of truth. And that might sound like a loss at first, but it's actually a deep gain. Because what falls away when you start living from your truth is only what was never truly aligned in the first place. People will leave, circumstances will shift, things that once seemed essential may suddenly feel hollow. But in their place, something else begins to emerge. People who meet you where you actually are. People who don't just tolerate your truth, but are drawn to it. People who recognize you, not the version of you you've spent years editing. And when that happens, connection takes on a new depth. It stops being about validation and becomes about resonance. That resonance is what your soul's been aching for. And you can't fake your way into it. You can't attract what you truly desire while hiding who you truly are. It just doesn't work that way. You might attract attention, opportunities, admiration, but they won't stick. They won't satisfy. Because they weren't meant for you, they were meant for the mask you were wearing. This is why living from your truth is both liberating and clarifying. You start to see the difference between chemistry and connection, between noise and meaning, between being wanted and being seen. And once you've tasted the peace of being met as you truly are, you'll never want to go back to anything less, no matter how shiny, seductive, or familiar it once seemed. The world has its way of teaching us that we need to mold ourselves to be chosen, fit in to belong, hide parts of ourselves to succeed. But the irony is, the more you shrink, the more you chase what doesn't fit. The more you try to be what others want, the more disconnected you become from what you need. And the further you drift from your truth, the more life starts to feel like you're always running toward something that doesn't fulfill you, or away from something you're afraid to face. But when you start living in your truth, you stop running. You become still, rooted, and that stillness speaks louder than any performance ever could. It tells the world, this is who I am. And in that declaration, you begin to magnetize. Not because you're trying, but because you're finally in tune. You're no longer throwing energy at things that drain you. You're no longer settling for connections that require you to self-abandon. You're no longer wasting time explaining or justifying your existence. Instead, you begin to attract from alignment, not desperation. You call in relationships, opportunities, experiences that reflect your actual values, your real essence. And these things don't come with the old anxiety, the constant fear of being found out, of being not enough, of being too much. They come with a sense of peace, of mutual recognition, of ease. That's not to say everything becomes effortless. No, life still has its challenges, its uncertainties. But you meet them from a different place, a place of inner knowing. You're no longer guessing at what's right for you. You feel it. You sense it. You've built a relationship with yourself that's based on honesty. And that relationship becomes the compass for everything else. And here's the beautiful truth. You don't need everyone to like you, understand you, or even agree with you. You just need to be in integrity with yourself. From that space, you'll find the people who resonate with your frequency. You'll walk into opportunities where you're not asked to shrink, but invited to expand. You'll experience a life that feels less like survival and more like alignment. Because the moment you begin to live from your truth, the world stops reflecting who you've been pretending to be and starts reflecting who you really are. When you begin to live from your truth, there's something subtle but profound that shifts inside of you. A quieting, a softening, a sense that for the first time in a long time, things are beginning to line up. Not because life suddenly becomes easy or predictable, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. That internal tension, the constant push and pull of trying to be who you're not, say what you don't mean, pursue what you don't actually value, it starts to dissolve, and in its place, peace begins to grow. Not the kind of peace that depends on everything around you being perfect, not the fragile kind that only exists when everyone else is happy and nothing is uncertain. This peace is different. It's not tied to the external world. It's anchored within you. It comes from knowing you're finally being honest, not just with others, but with yourself. That kind of inner peace can't be faked, and it can't be forced. It arrives slowly, almost like a sigh that's been held in for years. You might not even notice it at first. But then you realize you're no longer waking up with a knot in your stomach. You're no longer carrying that constant background anxiety that comes from betraying yourself in tiny ways every day. You're no longer performing, and that in itself is a massive relief. There's a deep exhaustion that comes from living out of alignment. It might not even look like struggle on the surface. You might have the job, the friends, the relationship, the recognition. But if it's not rooted in your truth, then it's all resting on shaky ground. And your nervous system knows it. That tightness in your chest, that restlessness in your thoughts, that vague but persistent sense that something isn't quite right. Even when everything looks fine, that's what happens when your outer life doesn't match your inner knowing. But the moment you begin living from your truth, your nervous system starts to calm. Not because everything outside of you has changed, but because you have. You're no longer split in two, one part of you living, the other part hiding. You're no longer silencing your gut feelings to keep the peace, or playing roles that slowly suffocate your spirit. You start speaking honestly, setting boundaries, listening to what your body is trying to tell you, and with each of those choices, you come back to yourself. It's not always glamorous. Sometimes it means sitting in uncomfortable silence. Sometimes it means walking away from things that once gave you comfort. But even in those moments of loss or uncertainty, there's a strange kind of calm. Because even if everything outside you feels uncertain, you're finally steady on the inside. You know you didn't abandon yourself this time, and that knowing brings peace, a quiet, grounded, unshakable kind of peace. What people often don't realize is how much energy it takes to live a lie, even small ones. The lie of saying you're fine when you're not, The lie of nodding along when everything inside you is saying no. The lie of pursuing goals that don't reflect your heart. These small betrayals pile up, and they don't just wear you out. They erode your spirit. They create a kind of internal static that keeps you from hearing yourself clearly. But when you stop lying, the static fades. You begin to hear your own thoughts again. You begin to trust your own voice. And as you rebuild that relationship with yourself, peace is no longer something you chase. It becomes something you return to, something that lives within you. Not because life is perfect, but because you are finally aligned. This doesn't mean you'll never feel fear or anger or sadness again. Of course you will. You're human. But even those emotions land differently when you're living in your truth. They move through you more easily, without getting stuck. You're not suppressing them to keep up appearances. You're not denying them to protect an image. You feel what's real and you let it flow. That, in itself, is a form of peace. The peace that comes from no longer resisting your own humanity. So many people are searching for peace in external places. The right job, the right relationship, the right location. But peace doesn't come from what you add to your life. It comes from what you remove, the pretending, the performing, the pleasing. The further you strip away what's false, the more peace rushes in to take its place. Because when you begin to live from your truth, you stop fighting yourself. And that's where real peace begins. There comes a moment once you begin living from your truth, when you stop and look at your life, not through the lens of what others expected of you, or what you thought you should want, but through the eyes of someone who has finally woken up. And what you see is revealing. You begin to recognize that so much of what you once chased was never really yours to begin with. The goals, the definitions of success, the timelines, the standards, all inherited from family, culture, education, media, and they never asked if those things were true for you. You simply adopted them. Because that's what we do when we're taught that the answers lie outside of us. But once you begin living from your truth, those old definitions begin to crumble. You realize that success is not a one-size-fits-all story. It's not always about climbing the highest, earning the most, or being the most visible. It's not about proving yourself. It's about knowing yourself. And suddenly, the life that used to impress you begins to feel empty. Not wrong, necessarily, just not aligned, not yours. You start to ask different questions. Not, what will make them proud, or what should I do next to get ahead, but what brings me alive? What feels meaningful to me? What kind of life would allow me to feel whole? These are quieter questions, deeper questions. They don't always come with immediate answers, but they open a door, and behind that door is your own personal definition of fulfillment. And here's what often surprises people: when you stop chasing society's version of success and start creating your own, everything begins to make more sense. You stop burning out trying to keep up with things that don't matter to you. You stop comparing yourself to people running races you were never meant to run. You stop measuring your worth by numbers, salary, likes, followers, titles. You begin to measure it by presence, by peace, by how honestly you're living, how deeply you're loving, how aligned you feel in your choices. This is not about giving up ambition, quite the opposite. It's about reclaiming ambition and making it your own. It's about directing your energy toward things that genuinely matter to you, not just what looks impressive from the outside. You might still build, still strive, still lead, but now it comes from a place of inner clarity, not external pressure. And yes, it might look very different from what others expect. Maybe your definition of success includes more rest, more family, more creativity. Maybe it means stepping back from something prestigious because it costs you too much of yourself. Maybe it means saying no to things that would have once made you feel important in order to say yes to what now makes you feel alive. At first, this can be disorienting, because for so long you've been rewarded for doing what you're supposed to do. The applause, the approval, they're powerful forms of currency in this world. But they lose their value once you start listening to your own soul. What becomes more important is feeling at home in your own life. And once you've had a taste of that, you stop being willing to sacrifice it just to look good on paper. You begin to realize that alignment is the real achievement. That your truth, your peace, your wholeness, these are the new milestones, not because they're soft or passive, but because they're rooted, sustainable, alive. You no longer need the world to tell you that you've made it. You know when you're living in alignment because you feel it in your body, in your breath, in your relationships, in the quiet moments when no one's watching. This shift is not something that happens overnight. It unfolds in layers, sometimes slowly, sometimes with painful clarity. You might grieve the time you spent chasing what wasn't yours. You might feel a sense of loss, of confusion. But underneath all of that, there's something deeply liberating. Because now, for the first time, you are the one defining what success means in your life. And no one can take that from you. That's the gift of living from your truth. It grants you permission to rewrite the story, to stop living by default and start living by design. Not a design handed to you, but one that rises up from within you. A design shaped by your values, your vision, your voice. Because once you begin to live from your truth, you stop chasing a life that looks good and start creating a life that feels good. There's something powerful that happens when a person begins to live from their truth. It doesn't just shift their own life, it sends ripples outward. And the beauty of it is, you're often not even aware it's happening. You're not trying to lead anyone. You're not making grand speeches or trying to convince people to change. You're simply living honestly, fully, authentically. And somehow, that quiet courage becomes a kind of invitation for others to do the same. People feel it. Maybe they can't put it into words, but they notice something different in you. The way you move, the way you speak, the way you hold space for yourself without apology. And when they witness that, it stirs something in them. It reminds them of something they've forgotten, the version of themselves that once knew how to be real before the world taught them to edit and censor and shrink. This is how truth works. It doesn't need to preach. It doesn't need to persuade. It simply is. And when someone lives it, it resonates. It cuts through noise. It lands deeply. It offers permission without even trying. And that kind of permission is rare in a world that often demands conformity. When you start living in alignment with who you really are, others feel safe to explore their own truth. Not because you told them to, but because you showed them it's possible. You showed them that you can be whole and messy and evolving and still deeply worthy. You showed them that you don't need to be perfect to be powerful. You just need to be real. This is especially important in a world so full of performative success and curated happiness. We're bombarded with images of how we're supposed to be. Confident, polished, in control. And yet, underneath all that performance, so many people feel disconnected from themselves. When you live from your truth, you break that pattern. You offer something far more compelling: presence. Presence that's rooted in honesty, not image. In depth, not decoration. And that honesty is contagious. It gives people the courage to stop pretending, to say, maybe I don't have to keep hiding either. Maybe I can stop living on autopilot. Maybe I can choose something different, something more real. It doesn't always happen in obvious ways. Sometimes it's just the way someone sees you choosing rest instead of burnout, or the way you walk away from something that no longer serves you, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect, or the way you allow yourself to take up space without apology, even if your voice trembles. These small acts of alignment send a message. You don't have to abandon yourself to be loved, respected, or successful. There's another way, and this is how truth spreads. Not as a doctrine, but as a lived experience. Not through noise, but through presence. You become a kind of lighthouse, not because you're trying to guide others, but because you're simply lit from within. Your life becomes proof that it's possible to be free and grounded, to be vulnerable and strong, to be true and whole. And yes, sometimes your truth will make others uncomfortable. Sometimes it will reflect back what they're not ready to face in themselves. But that's not your burden to carry. Your job is not to make others comfortable. It's to be faithful to your own unfolding. And in doing so, you'll find that the people who are ready to live in their own truth will be drawn to yours. There's a quiet recognition there, a resonance that goes beyond words. And those are the kinds of connections that nourish the soul. So don't underestimate the impact of your authenticity. Don't think it's just about your own healing. Every time you show up as who you really are, you give someone else permission to do the same. You become part of something larger, a subtle, powerful shift in how we relate to ourselves and each other. A shift from fear to freedom, from hiding to honoring, from surviving to truly living. Because when you begin to live from your truth, you don't just change your life, you quietly begin to change the world. If this message spoke to something deep within you, if it reminded you of a part of yourself that's ready to stop hiding and start living, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more content that speaks to the truth beneath the surface. Your truth matters, and together we create space for more people to live from theirs.